Welcome back to the channel. In this video I'll be discussing the Insta360 ONE R Aerial Edition for the Mavic Pro. I ordered this back in January right after CES, and it was supposed to ship at the end of February, which of course then COVID-19 delayed everything in the world. And it was finally shipped to me very late April, and I got it in early May. And I finally got some clear sunny weather for a few hours yesterday, got this up in the air, did all the preliminary installation steps of updating the firmware, and was really optimistic with what I'd be getting out of it. And there were several issues I ran into. One is the fitment of the lens mod cameras. There's one for the top flow state stabilization camera that's marked with that, has to be on the top, which I do have. And the cameras would flop around, so I had to find a corrective measure for that, and I alluded to that in a previous video on my channel. I chose a slightly different approach than I may have mentioned in that video, but I'll go through that. So I firmed up the cameras within the harness, so I thought, great, got that taken care of. Then the next issue was the actual video footage captured by the cameras. It ended up being quite poor. I mean, as far as color and everything, it looked great, but there were some quality issues with regard to stability of the footage, especially from the bottom camera. And it was jittery or jello-y, as you'll see in some of the sample footage that I captured. So we'll go through that. And then the whole supported workflow of using Adobe Premiere Pro to render a video from the Insta360 footage just is very poor. In the sense that it doesn't retain the information you tell it, and it doesn't save it in the project, and it doesn't allow you to actually use the Adobe Media Encoder to render your file. So we'll go through that. A lot of things I ran into in the last few days. I'm a little bit disappointed, especially after paying over $750 for this to get all the different pieces that I ordered, and then to find it's in this quality. And then chat support from Insta360 basically said, wait for later firmware, firm up the camera with some tape, and don't do that with the media encoder within Adobe Premiere Pro. So we'll go through that. If you have a question or comment related to this, make sure you leave it down in the comment section. If you have any questions about what's in the video, check out the description section, again, below the video here. Look for the links I have in that section of the video. And if you want to support the channel, consider becoming a Patreon supporter of the channel. It helps pay for things like this. It'd be greatly appreciated. And if you're curious about getting a subscription for music that you might be hearing in the background of this video, check out the link for Epidemic Sound and get a free trial by clicking on the link and check it out. So let's get into the first issue of firming up the lens mods in the harness. First issue is the lens mods flopping around in the harness. You can see that that's quite a bit of play in the harness for those particular issues. So I ended up addressing that by adding some automotive felt, actually two small strips on each corner. There's a particular end of that lens guard that fits best over those, but I applied this to both the top and bottom lenses, and it actually firmed it up very nicely without forcing the lens guard to be further away from the body of the harness. So you can see them on the tip of the corners there, and that was just enough to firm up the placement of the lens mods within the harness, and that's a better view. And you can see there's a flat surface on the end of that particular lens mod. That's true of both the top and bottom cameras, and that corresponds to the lens guard section I'll show you in just a moment. But you can see I applied it to both the top and the bottom, right at the very peaks of the corners, because that's where the lens guard hits the lens mod to hold it in place. And see those flat sections there? Those correspond to the flat section on the front of the lens mod itself. So that seemed to work out and corrected that particular issue. Now let's move on to the footage that I captured with my 360 ONE R, and the top lens appears to have dirt on it. I thought it was absolutely clean. I had lens cleaner I used with the microfiber towel that came with it. And the footage in the upper right hand corner here is actually the video footage captured by the DJI Mavic Pro camera. So you can it gives you a perspective of where the front of the drone is pointing at that point in time. So I'm getting it up in the air and moving it over this empty baseball field here, baseball diamond area. And when the drone is stationary, it's not so bad. But as I rotate around, of course, the 360 view is fixed at this point. It's holding where it was pointed at, although there is a little bit of drift in that, even though I haven't told it to change anything. So there's a little bit of a issue that you'd have to correct in editing to make sure it's pointing straight at what you were hoping it to be pointing at. And it's not so bad here. There's a little flutter on the right hand side. So when the drone is stationary, it's not horrible, but it's not great either. when there's movement in the drone, the stitching is pretty decent, but there's times where you tilt the drone to go side to side, left or right, and the line gets a little jello effect in the middle. And now we're changing elevation here, of course. And if we begin to look at the lower right here, the trees begin to jitter, flutter a little bit. And the baseball field underneath, not so bad at this point, but I'm again rotating the drone. You can kind of see the glass rotate through the image of the 360 footage as well on the lens guards. And at one point here, when I get stationary, I will start seeing a lot more flutter. Here it is here, where the trees on the right are basically, it looks like there's an earthquake running through the ground because everything's like flowing, like seismic waves going through the ground. It just, there's no way I could use this footage in any sort of professional video on my channel. It just wouldn't be accepted by the customer or myself. It just doesn't meet my quality requirements for video. Unfortunately, this, after spending $750 on this camera and all the equipment that came with it in the bundle and waiting so long, I'm very disappointed. This is the first video that I captured and this is the quality of it. And the chat support person said I needed to make sure that the cameras were stationary firm in their harness by taping them down, which I had already shown you in the previous section that I had done. So that was already in place. The firmware was 1.1.20, which was the latest to date. And as we go down in elevation here, you can really see the fluttering on the left-hand side. There's just no way I can use this, unfortunately. So the first use of this was a swing and a miss on this one. Very disappointed, and I was told to wait for later firmware. The next issue is a software issue, and Adobe Premiere Pro is a supported method of rendering files or processing files from Insta360 ONE R cameras. And I'm sure you can tell what's wrong here is you can see the lens guard edges, and it's just not quite the same footage. It's from the same timeline within Adobe Premiere Pro, same everything. And the only thing I did different here was I exported the video to generate the rendered file by using the Adobe Media Encoder, which is the typical workflow process for rendering video files out of Adobe Premiere Pro. You use the Media Encoder as the workhorse on the back end to generate the files. Well, this is what it did when I did that. There's some information apparently stored within Adobe Premiere Pro cached in it that's not stored anywhere, and I'll show you what I mean by that in just a moment. Now here's my workflow usually for Adobe Premiere Pro on Windows, where I use it to render the files for upload to YouTube. I have a timeline defined, which is actually the timeline for the 3-minute segment for the example footage I've been showing you, the good and the bad. It's the same timeline that was used to generate both. So in Windows, you select the timeline, you type Control-M, and you can then select the attributes for the export session for the rendering. And then down the bottom, there are 2 buttons. There's an export, which does the export rendering real-time within Adobe Premiere Pro. And then there's Q button, which is I use the Q button 99% of the time. And what that does is takes a snapshot of the settings in the project and exports it over to Adobe Media Encoder. And this is basically the workhorse behind the scenes for copying and rendering large objects and files and such within the whole suite within Adobe Premiere Pro. And it's been exported, and I tell it to run it. And notice in the preview of what it's rendering, it's got that line again. And as we saw before I exported it, it didn't have that within the real-time live view of it within the timeline in Adobe Premiere Pro. So there are attributes associated with the files in Adobe Premiere Pro that are not getting transported over into what's exported into Adobe Media Encoder. And when I submitted this issue to the chat support line, and after a long delay of reviewing it, they basically said, don't do that. Which, yeah, I know it's broken, but it doesn't mean that's the right answer, in my opinion. It just doesn't work, and it should work. There's no reason this shouldn't work. But I may have found why they said that. When I did some more testing this morning after the chat session, when I woke up this morning, I found that there's some caching going on, or some state consistency or inconsistency as far as the attributes related to the Insta360 video footage source files. So let's go over to that footage right now and I'll show you what I mean. We have Windows Desktop here. I'm bringing up Adobe Premiere Pro, and then I'll be opening the project related to the Insta360 ONE R footage that I've been using in this example. And there's a section where you need to set some attributes related to the Insta360 ONE R footage to let it know the various things in place, such as lens guards and whether you want flow state stabilization and all that in place. And by default, as you can see in the live view, you can see the lens guard edges here in the live preview of that timeline. So that problem is from the fact that it right now doesn't believe that there are any attributes to tell it that there are lens guards that is part of the aerial edition and all that. So we need to be able to go in and change those settings, and that's done by going over to the media navigator over the left in my particular setup in my Adobe Premiere Pro, and you can define what those attributes are. So I'll scroll down here, and you can set it on the first file in the two that are part of that 360 footage that was gathered. And if you right click on that, there will be a source settings, and you click on that and they'll bring up the pop-up dialog for the media settings for the Adobe Premiere Pro extension for the ONE R footage. And then you click the check boxes for everything, and then it goes through and then re-renders the live view. You can see that it looks correct in this particular case now, or as good as it's going to be at this point in time. But this is what the real live view with the proper attributes set are correct. And I'll go ahead and save the project. And if I take two different exits from the Adobe Premiere project, there's one where I just simply close the project, and then I can go back in and open the project again. So I'm still staying within Adobe Premiere Pro, and it prompts me to go open up one. I'm going to open up the same project that I just saved. And then as we come back in here and the live view looks correct. So that gives you the impression, gee, I saved it. The attributes are saved with it, and everything looks wonderful at this point. You think everything's great. And I got misled by this a couple of times yesterday because I didn't fully exit to get out, so it looks like it had saved it. But if I go back to the same file and then click on, again, the same source file and then source settings, and then we take a look at the properties, they're there. So those are retained. At least it implies that, you know, you close the project, opened it, they're still there. But there's weird changes also that takes place when you don't even change anything. The modification asterisk at the very top next to the project file comes up at weird times as well, like it modified something and you didn't change anything. So that might be an odd side effect, but there's some sort of caching going on. But there you can see the asterisk. I didn't change anything. I told it to cancel out of that. I didn't change anything, and they're still there. So that looks good. You think, I think everything's great, but let's go ahead and I saved it again, even because there was an asterisk there because it would have prompted me, and then I exit Adobe Premiere Pro altogether. I fully get out of the program. And now if I re-invoke Adobe Premiere Pro and open that same project, we're going to see that those attributes are lost. So that's much the same that seemed to occur with the media encoder when I exported it to the media encoder for rendering of the file. It didn't get them. Well, apparently a new instance of the same program, those attributes aren't stored in the project file, it appears. It's some sort of caching going on in memory or secondary storage that's not retained. And notice the black bars are there from the lens guards again. This is just wrong. So if you have a bunch of files that you set this a various set of attributes on from the ONE R footage, and you set them and save the project, you expect them to be set, they're not saving them. So that's a bug in my mind. So the impression was that the media encoder was the only one not retaining them. Well, apparently Adobe Premiere Pro doesn't retain them. As you can see, those radio buttons are not selected like they were before. I have to go back and reselect them before they will appear correct. The video will appear correct in this instance of Adobe Premiere Pro. So that's a bug in my opinion. I hope you found the information in this video informative and helpful to you. If you did, make sure you hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, make sure you hit subscribe and hit that bell notification to make sure you're notified when I upload new videos to the channel. I hope to find that Insta360 updates the firmware, corrects the issues in the video footage being captured, and improves that Adobe Premiere workflow, because That's not exactly what I would expect as normal behavior, but we'll wait and see. So thanks for coming to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.